I once held a stone the size of my palm that a human being had used 12,000 years ago. It was cold. It smelled faintly of nothing at all. And yet inside it, invisible to the naked eye, was proof of something nobody expected to find. I remember turning it over slowly, tracing the smooth, worn curve of the bowl with my thumb, trying to imagine the hands that had shaped it and used it, long before anyone had a word for what they were doing. That stone rewrote the timeline of one of humanity's oldest habits by thousands of years, and it wasn't tobacco farmers or ancient traders who left the evidence. It was hunter-gatherers living through the tail end of an ice age, thousands of years before agriculture even existed. Comment below and tell me where you're watching from, because this story involves a pipe, a fire, and a discovery that made archaeologists question everything they thought they knew about when human culture actually began. For most of modern history, the story of smoking felt fairly settled. Tobacco, cigarettes, colonial trade routes. A habit tied to the last few centuries at most, something firmly rooted in recorded history where we could name dates, names, and places with confidence. I remember the first time I read a paper challenging that timeline, and how unconvincing it initially sounded. Researchers were suggesting that smoking, in some form, might predate written history entirely, reaching back into an era when humans were still hunting mammoths and living in small, mobile groups with no permanent settlements at all. The evidence, when I actually looked into it, wasn't a single dramatic discovery. It was a slow accumulation of small, easily overlooked details, carved stones that resembled tools nobody could quite explain, scattered across sites in North America that had nothing to do with any known agricultural society. These objects had a distinctive shape, a hollowed bowl on one end, a narrow channel running through the middle. To anyone holding one today, the resemblance to a pipe is almost impossible to ignore. But resemblance isn't proof, and archaeology doesn't move on hunches alone. So a very specific question took shape among the researchers studying these objects. If these really were ancient smoking pipes, was there any way to prove it, thousands of years after whatever they once held had burned away completely? I spoke once with a researcher who described the frustration of that early period vividly. You could hold an object shaped exactly like a pipe, feel the smooth wear pattern along its bowl where countless fingers had once gripped it, notice the slight discoloration around the rim that seemed consistent with repeated heat exposure, and still have no way to prove any of it beyond visual inference. Shape alone, no matter how convincing, isn't scientific evidence. Skeptics within the field pointed out reasonably that similar hollow stones had been used historically for grinding pigments, holding small tools, or serving entirely mundane, non-ceremonial purposes. That skepticism turned out to be productive rather than dismissive. It pushed researchers to look for a method that could settle the question definitively rather than relying on shape and speculation alone. It's a useful reminder of how archaeology actually functions day to day, far less about dramatic eureka moments and far more about patiently narrowing down which of several plausible explanations the evidence genuinely supports. The idea of testing a stone object for residue that might have vanished 12,000 years ago sounds almost absurd on its surface. Organic material breaks down. Plant matter decomposes. Whatever had once been inside these hollow stones should have disappeared long before any human alive today was born. But stone has a strange property researchers have learned to rely on. Its dense, porous surface can trap microscopic chemical residues, protecting them from full decomposition far longer than almost any other surviving material from that era. It's not visible. It's not something you could see or smell by holding the object, the way I did years later. But it's there, locked into the mineral structure at a molecular level. Using highly sensitive chemical analysis, researchers extracted microscopic samples from the interior surface of one of these stone artifacts, recovered from a site in present-day Utah. What they were testing for was specific, a chemical signature unique to one plant in particular, one whose modern descendant almost everyone alive today would instantly recognize. The results came back unambiguous. Tobacco. Not a plant related to it, not something similar in chemical structure, but a direct match to the compound found specifically in tobacco. I think about the researcher who first saw that result, sitting in a lab, staring at data that meant something far bigger than a single positive test. It meant an assumption held for decades, maybe longer, had just been proven wrong. But one confirmed pipe alone couldn't tell the whole story. It could confirm what happened. It couldn't yet explain when. The process of getting to that result was far from simple. Researchers had to be extraordinarily careful about contamination, since even a trace of modern tobacco residue introduced accidentally through handling, storage, or previous museum display, could produce a false positive and undermine the entire finding. Samples were extracted under controlled conditions, using tools specifically cleaned and verified to be free of any prior exposure to the compound they were searching for. Every step, from extraction to testing to peer review, existed specifically to rule out the possibility that this discovery was simply an artifact of modern contamination rather than genuine ancient evidence. That level of caution matters enormously in archaeology, where a single high-profile mistake can set an entire field of research back for years. The researchers involved understood that a claim this significant, pushing the known timeline back by thousands of years, would face intense scrutiny from the broader scientific community. The evidence needed to be airtight before publication, which is part of why the process from initial suspicion to confirmed finding stretched across a considerable amount of time. Confirming the presence of tobacco residue was only half the puzzle. The other half required determining exactly how old the surrounding site actually was, using organic material recovered from the same archaeological layer as the pipe itself. Radiocarbon dating, a method that measures the predictable decay of a radioactive isotope present in all organic material, gave researchers their answer. The layer containing the pipe dated back roughly 12,300 years, placing it firmly within the final stretch of the last ice age. I want to sit with that number for a moment, because it's easy to read past a figure like that without absorbing what it actually means. 12,300 years predates agriculture. It predates permanent settlements. It predates writing by thousands of years. The people who used this pipe were living a fully nomadic, hunter-gatherer existence, moving with the seasons, hunting large Ice Age mammals that no longer exist today. And somewhere within that harsh, demanding existence, someone found time, motivation, and enough surplus attention to deliberately shape a stone tool specifically for the purpose of burning and inhaling a particular plant. It's worth pausing on just how demanding daily survival would have been during that period. Hunting large Ice Age megafauna required sustained physical endurance, coordinated group effort, and constant vigilance against genuine, immediate threats. Food storage was limited, shelter was often temporary, and the margin for error in a harsh climate was thin. Against that backdrop, the existence of a purpose-built tool dedicated to something beyond immediate physical survival says something meaningful about how these communities allocated their limited time and resources. That detail matters more than it might initially seem. Survival-focused societies don't typically invest specialized tool-making effort into something entirely without practical purpose. Whatever these early humans were doing with tobacco, it wasn't incidental. It was intentional, specific, and apparently valuable enough to justify the effort of crafting a dedicated tool for it. This raised an obvious follow-up question for every researcher working on this discovery. Was this a rare, isolated experiment by one small group? Or was it evidence of something far more widespread, still waiting to be uncovered at other sites nobody had thought to test yet? Once researchers knew what to look for, the picture started expanding rapidly. Chemical testing on other artifacts from different sites and different time periods began turning up additional traces: burned seeds, microscopic plant fragments, and residue patterns consistent with intentional plant burning across multiple, unrelated locations. None of these individual pieces of evidence, taken alone, would have been enough to draw major conclusions. A single burned seed could mean almost anything. A single fragment of ash could be coincidental. But taken together across multiple independent sites, a pattern started to emerge that was difficult to dismiss as random chance. I find this part of the story particularly striking, because it reflects how most major archaeological breakthroughs actually happen. Rarely is there one perfect, dramatic discovery that changes everything overnight. Instead, it's usually this: a slow accumulation of small, individually unremarkable pieces of evidence, gradually assembling into a picture nobody could see clearly until enough of the pieces were finally in place. What the assembled evidence suggested was that early humans weren't randomly experimenting with fire and plants in an isolated, one-time event. They appeared to be engaging in a deliberate, recurring practice, likely passed down through observation, memory, and shared knowledge within small communities, long before anyone had a written language to record it formally. This reframed how researchers thought about early hunter-gatherer cognitive life entirely. These weren't simply people focused exclusively on immediate survival. They were observing their environment carefully, experimenting deliberately, and preserving useful discoveries across generations through nothing more than memory and demonstration. I find it helpful to think about what that kind of knowledge transfer would have actually looked like in practice, without any written language to rely on. an elder demonstrating to a younger member of the group exactly which plant to select, how to prepare it, how much heat to apply, and what to expect from the resulting smoke. That knowledge, refined slightly with each generation through trial and observation, slowly accumulating precision over centuries, until it became reliable enough to be considered established practice rather than experimental guesswork. This is, in a very real sense, an early form of scientific method. Observation, repetition, and refinement, simply operating entirely through oral tradition rather than written documentation. As more evidence accumulated across different regions, another important detail became clear. This wasn't one single universal practice. Different communities, in different environments, appeared to be burning different plants, for what were likely very different reasons. Some evidence points toward medicinal use, plants burned specifically for their effect when inhaled, potentially used to treat specific ailments or discomfort. Other evidence suggests ceremonial or spiritual context, smoke used deliberately during specific rituals or communal gatherings, separate entirely from any practical medicinal purpose. Still, other findings suggest something closer to simple recreational or social use, comparable in spirit if not in substance, to how many people use tobacco or similar plants today. I think this variety is one of the most underappreciated parts of the entire discovery. It would have been simpler in some ways if the evidence pointed toward one clear, universal explanation. Instead, it points towards something more complex and, frankly, more human, different communities independently discovering that burning specific plants and inhaling the resulting smoke produced effects worth pursuing, then developing their own distinct practices and traditions around that discovery. This variation also explains why no single artifact or site tells the complete story on its own. Piecing together the full picture required comparing evidence across many different locations, recognizing that ancient humans weren't following one universal blueprint, but independently arriving at broadly similar behavior through very different specific practices. This kind of independent, parallel discovery across unrelated communities is actually a pattern researchers see repeatedly throughout human history, well beyond just this particular practice. Similar tools, similar agricultural techniques, and similar artistic conventions have all been shown to emerge independently in unconnected populations, separated by vast distances and centuries of time, simply because humans facing broadly similar environmental pressures and possessing broadly similar cognitive capabilities tend to arrive at broadly similar solutions. The discovery that plant material, when burned and inhaled, produced a noticeable effect was likely one of these convergent discoveries, made independently by multiple unconnected groups rather than spreading outward from a single point of origin. Following this thread forward through history reveals something almost as interesting as the original discovery itself. Rather than fading out as a strange, isolated Ice Age curiosity, the practice of burning plants for their effect appears again and again across nearly every major civilization that followed. Ancient Egyptian temples burned incense as a core part of religious ritual. Indigenous communities across the Americas used tobacco specifically during ceremonies and formal agreements between groups. Across parts of Asia, fragrant herbs became deeply woven into both religious practice and traditional medicine. The specific plants changed dramatically from region to region, but the underlying behavior, deliberately burning plant material and inhaling the resulting smoke, persisted with remarkable consistency. Researchers studying evolutionary psychology suggest this consistency reflects something deeper about human cognition generally, rather than something specific to any one culture or plant. Humans appear to carry a persistent drive toward environmental experimentation, constantly testing plants, substances, and materials to discover which ones produce noticeable, useful, or meaningful effects. Most experiments throughout history led nowhere significant. A small number, tobacco apparently among them, produced effects distinctive enough to be remembered, refined, and deliberately passed down across countless subsequent generations. I find it worth being careful here, because it would be easy to draw a straight, uncomplicated line between this ancient practice and modern cigarette use. That line doesn't really exist in any meaningful sense. Ice Age hunter-gatherers weren't purchasing packaged products, and they had no concept whatsoever of nicotine or addiction as we understand those terms today. They existed within an entirely different world, driven by entirely different needs, beliefs, and daily pressures than anything shaping tobacco use in the modern era. What strikes me most, looking across these different traditions side by side, is how consistently smoke itself became associated with transition and communication, regardless of geography or culture. Smoke rising from incense was frequently interpreted as carrying prayers or messages toward the divine. Smoke shared during tobacco ceremonies frequently marked the sealing of agreements or the beginning of important discussions between groups. Even in traditions with no direct connection to one another, smoke repeatedly took on symbolic weight beyond its simple physical effect, treated as something capable of bridging the gap between the physical and the unseen. That consistency, appearing independently across cultures with no contact with one another, suggests something about how deeply this practice became embedded in human symbolic thinking, well beyond its original practical or medicinal origins. Standing back from every individual piece of evidence, what this discovery ultimately represents isn't really about tobacco specifically. It's about curiosity itself, and just how far back that particular trait actually extends within our species. A single stone pipe, recovered from a hunter-gatherer site in Utah, quietly rewrote assumptions that had gone largely unchallenged for decades. It suggested that even in an era defined almost entirely by survival pressure, ancient humans still carved out space for observation, experimentation, and the deliberate refinement of discoveries worth preserving. Holding that stone years after the discovery was first published, I kept coming back to the same thought. Every assumption we hold about the limits of ancient human behavior is really just a placeholder, waiting to be revised the moment better evidence surfaces. For decades, the assumed timeline for the specific practice was confidently accepted, right up until a small stone object, tested using methods that didn't even exist when the assumption was first formed, quietly proved it wrong by more than 10,000 years. There's one detail worth sitting with before we go. Some of the same researchers who confirmed this dating now believe smoking may not have been humanity's first experiment with plant-based effects at all, simply the first one that happened to leave physical evidence durable enough to survive 12,000 years underground. Which means the true beginning of this story might reach back even further than any artifact currently discovered. And there may already be evidence of it sitting in the ground somewhere, simply waiting for the right researcher to think to test it, using a method nobody has thought to apply yet. Watch this next. The ancient plants archaeologists believe humans experimented with even earlier than tobacco, and the surprising evidence hiding inside teeth, bones, and cave walls.